it has been apparent you do not have what the noble art of divination requires. Indeed, I don't remember ever meeting a student whose mind was so hopelessly mundane. So she really calls out Hermione as not having this hopelessly mundane mind of all things. And we know Hermione is sharp. There was a moment of silence. Then, fine, said Hermione suddenly, getting up and cramming, unfogging the future back into her bag. Fine, she repeated, swinging the bag over her shoulder and almost knocking Ron off his chair. I give up. I'm leaving. And to the whole class's amazement, Hermione strode over to the trapdoor, kicked it open, climbed down the ladder out of sight. It took a few minutes for the class to settle down. Professor Trelawney seemed to have forgotten all about the Grimm. She turned abruptly from Harry and Ron's table, breathing rather heavily as she tugged her gauzy shawl more closely to her. Right? So Hermione is livid, even more upset in the book than we know. And even the professor is upset as well, too. So back-to-back instances where Hermione's character grows in the strength, right? She just becomes, instead of being like if you compare her now to what she was in the first book, we see that there has been character growth. She's stronger. Right. And that's somebody who, yeah, I agree, Francis, not somebody who you would call mundane. Okay. So let's get to the last chapters of this book. So we know that Harry finally gets his firebolt in the Quidditch final. And who do they go up against in the Quidditch final? Of course, it's Slytherin at the end, isn't it? Isn't it Slytherin at the end? It's Slytherin. Of course, it has to be Slytherin at the end. Because that's who his big nemesis is. And that's why he really wanted his firebolt. Okay. So as we start I know this is the last chapter 16, we also look at this idea. Hermione gets her schedule on page 315 for her final exams. And it says Monday, 9 o'clock arithmancy, 9 o'clock transfiguration, then it's lunch and it's 1 o'clock charms, and then 1 o'clock ancient runes. And it's again Ron who says, Hermione, how are you going to do this? You cannot have been doing this. Exactly. Slytherin, because Ravenclaw and Cho were earlier, right? So it's Ron again who's noticing that this is not going well for Hermione. And she's like, leave it alone once again. I've got this under control. Okay, so one of the things I also want to point out on page 318 is that their exams are practical exams. So it's not just that they can write. They do have a writing portion, but they also have, so they have a theory portion and like a lab portion, right? So they have like the portion where they have to actually perform and show that they've actually mastered the charms, the spells, and things, okay? So that's page 318. I wanted to point that out for those of you who are interested in that, in the topic on education. Don't know if anybody else is. Another moment of duality is the big prophecy that Trelawney has, right? At the end of chapter 16, there is a prediction, page 324, 325, right? Trelawney does have another prediction. She predicts that the Grimm is coming, and it's not just that, she calls him the Dark Lord. Now, in this book, there is no Voldemort, okay? So this is her prediction. This is at the end of class. They all get up, right? At the end, and I'll read it to you on page 323, 324, okay? Relieved, Harry got up, picked up his bag, and turned to go, but then a loud, harsh voice spoke behind him. It will happen tonight. Harry wheeled around. Professor Trelawney had gone rigid in her armchair. Her eyes were unfocused and her mouth sagging. Sorry, said Harry, but Professor Trelawney didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes started to roll. Harry stood there in a panic. She looked as though she was about to have some sort of seizure. He hesitated, thinking of running to the hospital wing. Then Professor Trelawney spoke again in the same harsh voice, quite unlike her own. The Dark Lord lies alone and friendless, abandoned by his followers. His servant has been chained these 12 years. Tonight before midnight, the servant will break free and set out to rejoin his master. The Dark Lord will rise again with his servant's aid, greater and more terrible than ever before. Tonight, before midnight, the servant will set out to rejoin his master. Who is this prediction about? This is foreshadowing. And again, the idea of duality, right? Yes, she is talking about Peter Pettigrew. Okay, she's Scabbers, exactly. So this is foreshadowing how the master is Voldemort and the servant is Pettigrew. Nicely done, guys. And so she wakes up and snaps to, and she says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, dear boy," she said dreamily. "The heat of the day, I drifted off for a moment." And so she thinks she did have like a little cat nap, and he's like, no. And she's like, "No, you predicted something about the Dark Lord." And she's like, "I certainly would not presume to predict anything quite as far-fetched as that." Harry climbed back down the ladder and the spiral staircase, wondering had he just heard Professor Trelawney make a real prediction, or had that been her idea of an impressive end to the test. Okay. And of course, now the plot is moving faster as we get through. We see that Trelawney is also duality, this idea of her being a divination professor, the idea of duality of the master and the servant. Okay, and then Hagrid returns to Ron his rat. Okay, and that's important because Scabbers is back. So as we start chapter 17, the titles of these chapters are